2020 was an exceptionally crap year, where ecological disasters, social unrest, threats of war, and plague were a bit too rampant for anyone's liking. In spite of everything that has happened, however, the world hasn't ended and we're still here. Unfortunately, though, there's something I gotta point out for everyone's sake. On December 14th, 2020, there was a total solar eclipse. We aren't out of the woods yet. Griffith is out there, and he's coming for us. I love Berserk, but being a fan of the series is something I've come to utterly detest. The drip feed release schedule is actual suffering, which, granted, is keeping to theme. It's why I've taken to ignoring chapter releases as they happen, and instead let them pool up over the course of a year. That way, I have a nice afternoon read, instead of the literature equivalent of getting locked out of the house. This year in particular, though, I get it. Lockdowns and everything else has made a typical work schedule difficult to uphold. It only makes sense 3 chapters were released instead of the 2 in 2019. Huh. I don't know how to process that. Chapters 360, 361, and 362 are markedly less involved than most of the chapters before them. They aren't action-packed or diving off the deep end like the adventures into Casca's mind. They're the downtime, the follow-up to everything that has recently happened, and lead-in for our next stage of the story. As a part of a larger whole, these chapters are great, but man, do they highlight the faults of Berserk's greatest weakness: the inconsistent release schedule, the constant hiatus. I know this isn't something new to complain about, but it really does kill the momentum and excitement the series has going for it from chapter to chapter. Berserk is exceptionally well paced. There's never a dull moment when it slows down to catch its breath. However, that becomes harder and harder to notice when the gap between releases keeps growing. I'm never hyped when I hear a new chapter is out because I know the next one is a long ways off. It's for that reason I've taken to reading what's new for Berserk at the end of the year. Gives me a, hopefully, consistent release date to look forward to. Allows my excitement to build. This title page is mocking me. Chapter 360 is probably the weakest out of the 3. Not because it's bad by any means, but rather due to how little actually happens. At least happens in relation to the plot. The chapter is focused on Shirke and Farnese, and how far these 2 characters have come, both as individuals as well as witches. Farnese has effectively taken the final step into becoming a full-blown wielder of magic, embracing what she's become as seen with her new clothing. But there are still some lingering doubts. The woman views herself as unworthy of the gift the Queen of Elfhelm had given her. Farnese's inferiority complex momentarily returns, but is promptly put to bed in a rather spectacular fashion. At first, to the mockery and then utter amazement of the other initiates, the woman is able to perform the array of the 4 cardinal points without a magic circle. She's able to do in a couple months of training what many still can't do after several years. As the audience, this isn't all that surprising. We've seen Farnese do this sort of thing before a few chapters back. However, it serves as a reminder that though our cast is up against exceptional odds, they themselves are still extraordinary. It's something that's nice to see since Berserk beats the hell out of its characters. These moments of triumph feel earned on account of how often we've seen them lose. Without instances such as this, small victories like these would be meaningless. Before moving on, there's a thought I had which I'd like to share. A part of me wonders how much of what we see Farnese achieve is due to the changing state of the world instead of her own ability. What I mean by this is, could the initiates pull off what she did as well due to the world being more fantastical? Is magic as a whole just easier to perform? I don't think this is the case because it would absolutely undercut what I believe the chapter is going for, the value of practical experience. However, it wouldn't bother me if it was. The takeaway: the difference between the initiates and Farnese wouldn't be absent, just different. Would highlight how the only thing holding the students back wasn't their lack of skill, but rather their own fear. Farnese has the courage to try new things, attempt these seemingly impossible because circumstance has demanded nothing less. You don't know what you're made of until you're forced to find out. Shirke has something similar going on in this chapter, but her growth isn't quite as stark as Farnese. Though I like her and she has grown, the girl simply lacks the baggage to make said growth stand out. She's a great witch. You know it. I know it. The story knows it. The chapter just makes that all the more apparent. Now it's time for someone I have a bone to pick with.
I shed blood of Saxon men. I shed the blood of the Saxon men.
Skull Knight. 2-3 times now since the cast has come to the island, Skull Knight has appeared at the end of a chapter and left us with an ominous cliffhanger. Ordinarily, this is fine, expected even, but when considering Berserk's erratic release schedule, it becomes utterly infuriating. Generally speaking, when Skull Knight appears, it's time to progress the overarching plot, since things have been moving incredibly slow for the past 2 to 3 years. It's exceptionally painful when he shows up and does nothing. This wouldn't be a problem if the series came out consistently, but it doesn't. Makes the admittedly brief pattern of behavior stand out. With Chapter 360, there isn't a ton to say. What you see is what you get, and you sadly don't get all that much. 361 and 362, however, are another story. Things are finally starting to move again, and man, it's satisfying to see. Chapter 361 starts off strong, with Guts calling out Skull Knight's crap. It's kinda great. Has just the right level of self-awareness and brevity to avoid getting on my nerves. It also shows off a growing level of camaraderie between the pair we haven't quite seen before. I don't think Guts outright trusts Skull Knight the same way he would Casca, Puck, and the rest, but there's something there. The relationship is growing a bit more casual, even though Skull Knight can't help but be cryptic. As it's aptly put, the pair are thick as thieves, kindred spirits. The chapter confirms, without stating it openly, that Skull Knight is in fact King Geyserreich. This is going to be delved into further in the next chapter, but it's a nice taste for what's to come. Something interesting was bound to happen when meeting the Berserker armor's creator, and it doesn't disappoint. We also get our first proper introduction to Morta, a character we've seen in the background for a while now, who hasn't done much of note. She's playful, rowdy, and a bit of a delinquent. The young woman is a perfect counterpoint to Shirke and her more uptight demeanor. Might be wishful thinking on my part, but I can already see Morta joining the cast. She's got that rebellious streak and desire for adventure. Here's hoping she doesn't fade into obscurity like Yzma, or wind up being the reason Elfhelm is destroyed. While Morta and Shirke interact with Granny Vol, Morta's mentor, something inexplicably struck me. Throughout Berserk, there's been a consistent inversion between what we often perceive as good and evil. The aesthetic differences between Guts and Griffith is one example of what I mean. Now, it might be because the cast is off to meet a dwarf, or on account of this line, but a part of me is wondering if Berserk will end with a Ragnarok-like event, where the forces of good and evil are flipped. What was once considered wicked by mankind, magic, the gods of old, etc., rise up from below the earth to challenge that which is perceived as virtuous. The God Hand, Griffith, you name it. The great battle that follows ends with the world's destruction, the ultimate inevitability which causality embodies, but said end marks a new beginning. Somehow, some way, mankind survives and ushers in a new era. I don't buy it myself, but this chapter and parts of the next gave me this vibe, yet I can't explain why. If anything, I'm curious what you guys think. There's just something immensely compelling imagining Guts as Fenrir. He's got that overwhelming rage, canine motif, and has been bound by the chains of causality his entire life. It's a loose connection, but I think there's something there. I might give this idea a bit more thought, and who knows, maybe I'll do something with it in the near-ish future. Despite the moment's more somber tone, it's nice to see Guts be reminded of a close friend when meeting Hanar. The parallel between the two is a nice touch, and shows the audience the blacksmith's death was one of, if not the only peaceful death, Guts has experienced. He could think back on it without feeling guilty or enraged. I found Chapter 361 to be a marked improvement over 360. It gave me a few things to think about and actually progressed the story forward. We got to meet new characters, learned a bit more about the world, and even had a few reveals which were a long time coming. Having said that, I'm extremely thankful I didn't read this at release, because, man, that ending is brutal. Berserk already has us by the short hairs. We really don't need a cliffhanger ending to make us crawl back for more. Moving on to my favorite chapter of the three, Chapter 362. It picks up right where the previous one left off, with Guts being bound by magical chains. Once more, I'm reminded of the Fenrir parallel, but that's besides the point. What makes this stand out over a lot of other recent entries in Berserk is twofold. The first is the presentation. Though there's some spoken dialogue, the bulk of this chapter's storytelling is done visually. I love it when a work plays to its unique strengths, and this chapter does precisely that. The second reason this stands out, however, comes down to the story being told. Specifically, Skull Knight's story. As we've seen for some time now, this chapter makes it abundantly clear that Skull Knight and Guts are kindred spirits. Their stories mirror one another. Long ago, before he entered the Bone Zone, Skull Knight had opposed the God Hand. We still aren't entirely sure of the circumstances behind why he did so, but they appear to be deeply personal in nature. The old king seemed to have lost both a loved one, as well as his kingdom, to a sacrifice whose likes we've seen before. What's interesting to note is how the God Hand isn't as we know it. The only entity there which we're familiar with is Void. This was what I meant earlier concerning the chapter giving me Ragnarok vibes, how one end is just another beginning. Though it's just speculation based on what little I've seen, perhaps the world has been undone and remade before. Perhaps the old God Hand was put down by Skull Knight long ago. Gotta say, it bothers me how this guy looks a lot like Ganishka. Raises a lot of questions, especially if it is, in fact, Ganishka. Also, I thought this woman was the individual that would go on to become Slan for a hot minute. But then I noticed the brand on her shoulder and realized I was as blind as a bat. Despite how much I enjoyed this chapter, there just isn't a ton to say. What you see is what you get, and what you get has little explanation. Thankfully, that seems to be the next thing Berserk is going to address. So, relatively speaking, we shouldn't have to wait all that long for some sort of answer. Assuming, of course, though, we don't have a sudden shift to a Rickert chapter just out of the blue. What I love about Chapter 362 is its substance. It captured both my attention and imagination in a way a lot of other recent chapters just couldn't. There's something going on. I'm excited to see what comes next, and more importantly, satisfied with what I got. To amend something I said at the start of the video, Berserk's biggest weakness is less so its drip feed release schedule. Granted, that doesn't help, but rather how unsatisfying most releases are in proportion to how long we have to wait. If every chapter was like 362, I'd be hyped for the next release instead of how I am now. Happy, but not excited. Chapters 360 and 361 are entertaining. Don't get me wrong. However, Berserk isn't released monthly or bi-monthly. If they were, they'd have enough substance to keep me satisfied until the next release. But that isn't how things have been playing out. Truth be told, I wish Miura would stop tackling Berserk like a monthly manga and instead treat it like a graphic novel. If he changed the format and behind-the-scenes production into something focused on a larger work, he'd probably find a lot more success, both in work output and reader satisfaction. Though it might sound odd, a more episodic story can often be far more restrictive than something more, shall we say, complete. Granted, this does depend upon the writer, however, Miura's style seems far more suited to a longer-form project. Think about it. There's rarely ever a singular standout chapter in all of Berserk. Instead, when fans talk about the series, they refer to the larger arcs, be it the Golden Age, Lost Children, Conviction, you name it. The ones that do stand out, however, are climactic points in one of the arc's various acts, be it the Eclipse, Griffith's Rebirth, or Casca's Return. Though they work well on their own, they're so much better when put into the proper context, when you read the previous chapters like a book, and work up to it as opposed to stopping, then waiting for months on end. Miura has an eye for pacing, so if he planned Berserk out like a novel, passed the details off to his assistants and attacked it like a book, I'm fairly certain he'd be able to pull off a consistent, but more importantly, satisfying yearly release. Instead of getting distantly connected chapters like we've been seeing, ones you're better off reading together in one sitting, we get something like the Golden Age films. A solid, enjoyable experience in its own right that makes us look forward to whatever else is in store. But with that said, guys, I've been Boofire191. Tell me what you thought in the comments down below. I'll see all you guys next time. Goodbye.